Please be warned, this episode contains graphic descriptions of violence and atrocities against people, which may be alarming to some listeners.
The next stage in our dehumanization consisted of the complete shaving of our heads with dulled clippers of wood. Stripped of our clothing with our heads shaved to the scalp, we stood in some sort of hideous huddle, a mass of bodies incapable of recognizing each other, subjected to unending abuse from the assessment, who strolled around near us giggling in amusement. Some of the women who were trying to cover their nudity were a sad sight because their once shapely bodies had been nightmarishly deformed as a result of forced undernourishment during several years of wartime starvation. Folds of skin hung from their bellies, breasts, and buttocks, monsters from a Bosch painting.
Hello, thank you so much for joining us on the Auschwitz podcast. This is our first episode and just a little bit of an introduction. So I am Alina Novobilska. I've got with me Dr. Kate Vigers and Chris Sams. Kate, do you want to say hi to our listeners?
I'd love to. Hello, everybody, and thanks for tuning in.
And Chris, just so they know what you sound like.
Hello.
Just to let you all know, the podcast will be about 20 minutes maximum and they'll be out on the following days. So today, which is the 14th of January, 16th of January, 18th, 19th, 21st, 24th, 27th, 29th, and 30th. And the reason we're not keeping it so straightforward as a day by day like we did with the Warsaw Uprising is because there's certain days where things happen where it's only one thing. Anyway, the testimony you just heard, and we're going to be having a testimony just like this for every episode. And this one is done by Helena Donic-Niewinska. She was a Polish prisoner who ended up in Auschwitz. She was a political prisoner. And the testimony came from her book, One of the Girls in the Band, the Memoir of a Violinist from Birkenau. And this book is actually published by the Auschwitz Museum. So I'd highly recommend you go and grab yourselves a copy. It's an excellent book. So do go grab yourselves a copy. Anyway, what we're going to start off with is just a little bit of context about Auschwitz. So those of you who do follow me on social media should already know that Auschwitz began on the 14th of June 1940 with the first mass transport of 728 Poles and obviously a handful of Polish Jews in there. At this point, Auschwitz was not an extermination camp. It was a concentration camp. It was indirect extermination. So for those of you who don't know what that means starvation, fear, execution, forced labor, and disease, and people were dying in droves. Auschwitz then changed its function by the spring of 1942, where it changed to not only indirect extermination, but also direct extermination, meaning people arrive to the camp, they're selected, and those who are not deemed suitable for forced labor are directly exterminated in the gas chamber. However, let's move on. You know, I could sit here as Kate and Chris know talking about Auschwitz for 65,000 hours and we still wouldn't have a year available to be able to talk about what we wanted to. But I'm going to move on very swiftly to 1944, where Auschwitz reached its peak, because by this stage you have over 105,000 registered people in 3 main camps and over 40 sub-camps. This is quite important. These 40 sub-camps, we're not going to go through all of 40 sub-camps, just so you all know, but we will be covering some of the evacuation processes of some of these sub-camps because some of them are still active in 1945. And it's quite important to be able to show you that Auschwitz just wasn't one camp or 2 camps, say the main camp in Birkenau, but it was made up of many more places than just what we see today. So there's also approximately 30,000 Jews that are not registered in 1944. They're being held in what we would call a transit camp. So we have another added 30,000 people in there. We need to remember that in 1944, there's over 600,000 Jews. I mean, that is a huge amount that's deported in only 1 year. That's made up primarily of Hungarian and Polish Jews. Extermination ends in October of 1944. Many people think that it continues all the way up until 1945, but it doesn't. It ends in October of 1944. And this is also roughly about the same time that the camp evacuations begin and the destruction of evidence also starts. We have 65,000 prisoners that are moved from Auschwitz in 1944, and a lot more, which we'll talk about a little bit later, of prisoners that are moved in 1945. The destruction of the camp also begins by dismantling barracks, for example. Some of you who may have been to Birkenau, you may have seen that on the furthest right-hand side, you have section B3, and that was called Mexico. They only had half a dozen barracks that had already been erected, but those ones by this stage are now being taken down. Parts of the women's section on the left-hand side in the B1 section are being dismantled. The decision to evacuate Auschwitz wasn't truly made up until the Soviets were only 70 kilometers from the camp. That's between the 17th and the 21st, where 56,000 prisoners are evacuated. Chris will cover more about the Soviets, so listen out to that one. The SS also end up plundering. They take stuff with them, and they have time. Auschwitz actually has time to evacuate at this stage. The difference here is, and we will cover this a little bit later, is that the first concentration camp to be liberated is Majdanek. They didn't have time to destroy the crematorium. Well, they tried actually, but they failed. They didn't have time to destroy the gas chambers. Auschwitz does. And we will cover all of that in the podcast. Right. So, as I mentioned, Chris is going to cover a little bit of things on the Soviet front and what's actually happening, because we can't really talk about Auschwitz without talking about the advancing Soviets, can we, Chris?
No, not at all. And the Eastern Front is actually probably more critical than the Western Front through 1944 and 45, which is probably going to upset a few people. But to give the push in 45 a bit of context, in 44 you have Operation Bagration, which ends in August 44. And the Red Army have caused the German army in the east 1.5 million casualties, liberated Belarus, Latvia, Lithuania, and massive gains in the eastern territories. They stop before Warsaw, which you would have heard about in the Warsaw Uprising podcast, and instead turn south to secure their flanks in Hungary and Yugoslavia and drive the Germans out of there. The Germans have also expended a vast amount of resources, not just in losses against the Russians, but also in Warsaw as well. This is then coupled with the losses on the Western Front. American listeners will know a lot about this, but the Battle of the Bulge, the last dice roll in the West, the Germans send the majority of their armour and expend the last of their available aircraft to try and push the Americans and the British out of Belgium and take the port of Antwerp, which falls firmly on its face, and they lose much needed infantry, armour and aircraft over the course of the winter of 1944. Then in January, just to kick the Germans when they're down, the Russians make another lunge west with several fronts, mainly to take as much of Poland as possible, as well as swing up north and take East Prussia. But they're also advancing in the south as well. And the front that we'll be kind of looking at is the Western Carpathian Offensive, which is going to begin in what's now modern-day Slovakia. And it will kick off on the 12th of January with nearly 600,000 men, 9,000 artillery pieces, 3,000 tanks. And they're aiming to push back the 250,000 German soldiers who only have 1,500 guns and 540 tanks. But even if we zoom in even closer, because obviously this is quite a wide front as well, we'll be looking specifically at the 60th Army, which is going to be advancing on a 100-kilometre wide front and engaging the 17th German Army. And the German force consists of only 6 divisions, totaling about 57,000 men. And these aren't divisions as they were in like 1940 or 1941. They're very much depleted. And the Volksgrenadier divisions of the 78th, 320th, 544th, and the regular infantry divisions of 359th and 371st. And you'd think Volksgrenadier would be sort of like the Volkssturm, just like peasant, sort of people forced into it. They tend to be actually more reorganized divisions from people with lots of experience, built around holding and defenses, and then the numbers fleshed out with sailors and airmen who don't have planes or ships. So they're actually really quite good in comparison to the normal infantry divisions. So Kate's going to talk to us about a consequence, which happens in January, but it actually unfolds from an event that happened the year before, didn't it, Alina?
Yeah, we're going to kind of backtrack a little bit. Chris has brought us into January, but we're going to go back into 1944, and we're going to go back into, October of 1944, and we're going to talk about the uprising, the Sonderkommando uprising in Crematoria number 4. So for some of you who don't know what the Sonderkommando is, just a very layman's term, it was a group of men who ended up being forced into participating in the gassing process, meaning putting corpses into the ovens, taking victims out of the gas chambers and things like that. And they were primarily Jewish prisoners. So where does all of this start? So in the autumn, as I said, slowly but surely the Germans have started evacuating prisoners, and they start to eliminate the Sonderkommando prisoners. The first Sonderkommando prisoners are murdered in September. And also, I just want to add a note here. When people say that Sonderkommando prisoners were changed every 3 months, that's total rubbish. What is the point in having to teach someone how to participate in the gassing process and you're having to teach them all over again rather than having somebody that they had all the way from the beginning? This is quite a unique situation that the Sonderkommando prisoners are murdered in September, but you can't leave evidence. And I spoke about this at the beginning. You have to eliminate and get rid of pretty much everything that they've been doing. Some of these Sonderkommando at this point have already left memoirs and things and notes. And what they've done is they've sealed them up in jars and buried them around the crematoria. And it was 50s, 60s, and I think even up to the 80s were people who were still discovering these basically gold mines in jars. It's absolutely incredible. And there's a fabulous book written about it. And later on, I'll put some really good sources that if people are interested into the bio of our podcast. The Sonderkommando have already planned an uprising. There are several conspirators, and we'll actually hear from, we've got a testimony that I can't remember, somewhere in this podcast that Kate and I are going to be talking about, which is from Shlomo and Abraham Dragon. And they're one of the conspirators that take part in this uprising. So it begins on the 7th of October, and that's because on that day, they were planning to get rid of a group of Sonderkommando. During the revolt, they rebel, they gather in crematoria number 4, they attack the SS guards, and they set fire to the undressing room inside the building. Then the armed SS guards, they arrive, they open fire on the rebels, killing most of them in the crematoria courtyard. Now, once this has been put down, the SS conduct a selection among those Sonderkommando prisoners that have, they've survived throughout all of the crematoria. Those that were shot, they were forced to lie on the ground, and then they were executed with a shot to the back of the head. Now, at the same time that crematoria number 4 is uprising, there is also an uprising happening in crematoria 2. They try to blow up the crematoria furnaces. It fails. It's successful in crematoria 4, but it's not successful in crematoria 2. Those prisoners that are remaining, it's about 80 prisoners or so, they manage to cut through the barbed wire fences that enclose the crematoria, and they more or less, they run. They don't get very far. They get about 1.5 kilometers. That's about a mile, if I'm not mistaken. And they are caught because they're still in the camp zone of interest. They were still in it, even though they were a mile out. They were all killed. And the consequences of the uprising will be talked about by Kate. But before we get to that, I want you all to listen to a testimony by Hendrik Mandelbaum. Hendrik Mandelbaum was a former Sonderkommando member, and he testified in the post-war trials. So let's have a listen to what he's got to say.
As for us prisoners working in the crematoria, we could not reconcile ourselves with our situation. In 1944, we decided to organize an uprising that would also incite the entire camp. I know that we made grenades. There were also weapons in the camp. Unfortunately, I cannot provide any further details about that. On the day when the uprising broke out in the Sonderkommando, I was working in a crematorium located farthest to the north. Crematorium 5. From the adjacent crematoria across the way, the SS men were to take prisoners, allegedly to another camp. That was direct reason for the uprising and the burning of that crematorium. After the suppression of the uprising, the SS men vented their fury at the remainder. They ordered us to lay face down on the ground, and every third man was executed. They were shot in the back of the head. I heard that in the crematorium that was burned down. Prisoners from the Sonderkommando placed the capo of German nationality in the furnace. This is supposedly the traitor the one who had warned the SS men about the uprising. This is at least what I heard, although I was not an eyewitness to the event.
So, according to other sources, the functionary prisoner was killed, and it was at Crematoria 2 that a capo or functionary prisoner was thrown into a furnace. So, the SS next conducted investigations to try and get rid of the resistance movement within the Sonderkommando, and they wanted to identify the prisoners who were employed in the Union Werke warehouse factory who supplied the explosives for the revolt. So they managed to find a dozen Sonderkommando prisoners, as well as female prisoners employed in the munitions factory who were arrested. The Sonderkommando members were murdered in Block 11, which, if you have visited Auschwitz, is right at the end of the camp. Horrible place. I certainly never go in it when I'm on my tours. But the 4 women were not executed in the block. The women, and if you'll excuse my pronunciation, but I do feel we need to name them, Ella Gartner, Rosa Roberta, Regina Savitstan, and Estera Valsblum were sentenced to death. And their execution was divided into 2 parts, and the SS wanted to make it as public as possible. So 2 prisoners were hanged during an evening roll call where the female prisoners were present, as well as prisoners who were working on the Union Werke on the night shift. The remaining 2 prisoners were also hanged in public, just as workers were returning back to their camp, again after their shift at the warehouse. So it was a very, very public punishment. The sentence was executed on the gallows by the first director of Auschwitz, Husler. And apparently he shouted, "This is how all traitors shall be destroyed." So, Alina, is there anything else we wanted to add about the evacuations in 1944?
The other thing I wanted to add about the evacuations, I'm going to be super quick on this, is that a lot of Polish prisoners were moved out of the camp complex between 1942, 43 and 44, especially in 1944, and only prisoners that were important were kept. So prisoners who worked in the electric department or that the SS deemed that they were needed in the camp, they were the ones who predominantly stayed. Otherwise, most of them were sent on to other concentration camps, and some people try to get to what we would say marginally better concentration camps. So, for example, it was well known through the camp that Mattenhausen, for example, ending up in Gusen, which was a clear death sentence where thousands of Poles were worked to death. So they would try and get themselves to other concentration camps, for example, Sachsenhausen, where they knew they had a slightly better chance of survival. Kate, we're going to come back to you actually on this. And that's the topic of releasing prisoners. A lot of our listeners might think you could get released from Auschwitz. Well, yes, you could. And Kate, take us away with this one.
So, yes, you could get released from Auschwitz, and there are preserved documents from the camp administration which didn't get destroyed, which show us various points in the camps being where prisoners were released. So it shows us that about 1,600 Polish political prisoners, about 200 Czechs, and a few prisoners of other nationalities, including Germans and those from the Netherlands, were actually released from the camp. The greatest number of prisoners who were released were actually quite early on in the camps, being late autumn of 1940 to the end of summer 1942. So earlier you mentioned the first transport, Alina, 728 men brought to Auschwitz. They arrived there on the 14th of June 1940, and of them 70 had been released by the spring of 1942. Also in 1940 there was a transport from Warsaw with 3,600 deportees, and about 330 of those were also released. So the number of prisoners released from Auschwitz increased again from 1944, but mostly included German criminals. There were about 200 of these who left Auschwitz and were recruited to the infamous SS Dirlewanger units who committed atrocities during the Warsaw Uprising. The SS also released Poles who'd been sent to the camp basically for patriotic reasons. They belonged to resistance organizations or patriotic organizations. So on the release day, the prisoners were summoned to the office of the political department. In that office, they had to sign an affidavit not to conduct any hostile activity against the Reich, so no rejoining the resistance, and a statement that they'd not suffered any harm, nor were they allowed to demand any claims for their stay in the camp. They were also told that under no circumstances were they allowed to talk about what they had seen in Auschwitz. They then received their clothes from the warehouse, and they were escorted under strict guard to the railway station, where the SS man bought them train tickets. He didn't buy them out of his own pocket money. This was the prisoners' money that had been sitting waiting for them, and he stayed with them at the platform until the departure of the train. Once a prisoner was freed, they were required to report at the work site immediately, so if they were joining the German army, and they also had to report every few days at the police station. And after some time, if they towed the party line and they did as they were told, the Germans stopped the supervision measure. So whilst, yes, people were released, there were very, very strict circumstances under which those releases happened.
Thanks for that, Kate. I think we can listen to Zbigniew Turecki's testimony on that. He was one of the prisoners from the first transport to be released.
One autumn day after roll call, the block leader called my number. All my friends looked at me because, usually, when that happened, no one expected anything good to come of it. Interrogation by the Gestapo, or death, or some severe punishment in the isolation cell. I never expected such a thing as release from the camp. It was a great surprise to me and everyone when he announced that I would go to Block 20 for quarantine before being released. I was almost more shocked than if I had been condemned to death because I was always prepared for the latter. Block 20 was used to prepare prisoners for the outside world and gave me, average prisoner, hope that he might also be set free one day. Immediately after, Obojski and my other friends met me. We discussed my release and tried to discover some good reasons for it. I did not know anything and could not make a guess.
It's interesting because this is the guy, there was an administration problem. This guy gets rearrested, doesn't he?
Yeah, actually, to be honest, this guy has the wildest history in one of the wildest histories in Auschwitz, because he actually is mistaken. So it should have been his cousin that got released, and they didn't actually check his number against the list. And they just went, oh, Zbigniew Turecki, which his cousin has exactly the same name. But the really horrible thing about this is that when he is rearrested and brought to the camp, in the meantime, his cousin actually dies. And Zbigniew Turecki's story is actually a little bit personal for me, because he was one of the first prisoners that I used during my master's thesis. And it was him and his testimony that actually broke me and made me have to take a 2-week break. It's all down to do with his testimony when he speaks about the death of his brother. And because they basically were arrested together, they went through the whole prison together, they went through the whole beginning of Auschwitz together, and his brother gets killed. Well, he actually dies from a bleed, I think it was to his stomach or something, like internal bleeding, basically, after being kicked by a functionary prisoner. And then his brother dies, and he just writes about the pain and how alone he feels. And I read it, I closed the book, and I went back to the archives. I went, thank you very much. I now need to take a break. So Zbigniew Turecki, quite a bit of a personal one for me.
Yeah, absolutely. Although I'm going to wander down a slight rabbit hole and discuss SS organisation at the same time. Because, I mean, when I first heard about it, I thought it was kind of strange, because I thought that the whole camp system was just handled by the SS. And to a degree it is. The SS is kind of multifaceted in itself. So we're mostly talking about the Totenkopfverbände branch of the SS. And at Auschwitz, they're divided into 5 parts. You've got Abteilung 1, which is the command HQ. 2, political department or Camp Gestapo. 3, preventative detention camp. And then 4, which is general administration. And 5, which is the medical unit. Now, the Politische Abteilung is not under the concentration camp directorate itself, but is actually under the local Gestapo or RHSA. And they're usually headed by a Gestapo man or a member of the Sicherheitsdienst, which is the SD, which is also part of the SS. So it kind of, there's a lot of muddling. And then the majority of the staff tend to be SS men from about the camp. There's quite a bit of overlap as well, although, as I said, the Gestapo don't report directly to the commandant at all. They report to the local Gestapo, except on disciplinary measures. They are responsible for all the identification documents, investigations, interrogations, intelligence services, surveillance, and camp register, which all record each prisoner's time in a camp. They're also the guys that are responsible for hunting down any escape attempts, especially before they happen, and dealing with any armed insurrections by the prisoners, and they can use any means necessary. They've basically got carte blanche to do whatever they want, so they can go from standard interrogation to full-blown torture, in which case they're allowed to be inventive. Wilhelm Borger's secretary, Frau Braun, describes the bogus swing, which, in her words, it's a metre-long iron bar suspended by chains, hung from the ceiling. Prisoner will be brought in for questioning, stripped naked, bent over the bar, wrists manacled to ankles. A guard at one side would shove him or her off across the chamber in a long, slow arc, whilst Boger would ask questions, at first quietly, then barking them out, and at the last bellowing. At each return, another guard, armed with a crowbar, would smash the victim across the buttocks. As the swinging went on, and the wailing victim fainted, was revived, only to faint again. The blows continued until only a mass of bleeding pulp hung before their eyes. Most perished from the ordeal, some sooner, some later. In the end, a sack of bones and flayed flesh and fat was swept along the shambles of the concrete floor to be dragged away. So they can be really quite brutal, and they usually are. The last trial was carried out by the political departments in January 1945 in Block 11, and 70 Polish men and women are sentenced to death, later to be shot in Crematoria 5 at Birkenau. Amongst the murdered are Adam Tondots, who, along with 11 other people, managed to graffiti. They scratch their names into the wall and request that whoever reads this to find their families and inform them of their death. Also in the group is Antoni Szachsitz, who's a member of the Oswiecim district of the Home Army. He was arrested in May 1944 and interrogated and tortured many, many times. He also carves his name into the wall. With the fall of the Third Reich being imminent, the Germans are trying to get rid of as many of their personal enemies as they possibly can in acts of vengeance at this time, and he was one of them.
Well, that is it for the end of episode 1 of the Auschwitz podcast. Thank you so much for joining us. And if you want to support us further, then please consider joining our Patreon, where you can find extra content the day after each episode is aired. Just head to patreon.com/moments_in_time. Or if you don't want to sign up but want to give us a one-off payment, then you can do so at ko-fi.com/momentsin time. Thank you so much again, and we'll see you all on the 16th of January for episode 2.